He was one of the youngest faces on one of cable television's most quietly beloved shows. And then, without a single announcement, a farewell episode, or even an acknowledgement from the production, he was just gone. Not dramatically, not with controversy trailing behind him. He simply became less present, then barely present, then absent in the way that only gets noticed once enough people ask the same question at the same time. That's Ryan Eldridge, nephew to Chase Morrill, apprentice carpenter on Maine Cabin Masters, and the kind of cast member who gave the show a dimension it couldn't have gotten any other way. The unscripted, unpolished arc of a young person learning something real in front of millions of people who were rooting for him. And by the time the comments section started filling up with questions about where he'd gone, the answer had already been unfolding for years. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what changed for Ryan, but why his story is actually the most honest thing Maine Cabin Masters ever put on screen, even after the cameras stopped following him. Maine Cabin Masters didn't arrive as a polished concept pitched in a Los Angeles conference room. It arrived because a real family in a real state had been doing real work for long enough that the work itself became the pitch. Chase Morrill and his crew weren't recruited from a talent pool. They were found because what they were already doing, restoring old cabins across Maine, working alongside family members and longtime friends, treating each job as something worth caring about, made for television that felt unlike almost anything else on cable at the time. The show premiered on DIY Network in 2016, and from its earliest episodes, it was clear that the appeal wasn't purely the craftsmanship, it was the people. The Morrill family operated with a specific set of values that the audience recognized immediately. Work hard, do it right, don't cut corners, and treat the people you're working for as though their property matters as much as your own. Those aren't complicated values, but they're increasingly rare on television, which is precisely why they stood out. Ryan Eldridge was part of that world long before anyone was filming it. As Chase's nephew, he grew up inside the culture of the family business, surrounded by conversations about materials and methods, present at job sites during the years when they were just job sites, and not the backdrop of a television production. He didn't arrive on set as an outsider being integrated into a family dynamic for the purposes of good television. He was already in the family dynamic. The television production came to him. That distinction matters enormously for understanding why Ryan's story on the show feels different from the story of a cast member who is hired to fill a role. He wasn't hired to fill anything. He was there because he belonged there, which meant his presence on camera always carried the authenticity of someone who had no reason to perform anything. The dynamic between him and Chase wasn't produced, it was inherited. And inherited dynamics between family members in a trades environment, where the older generation has to trust the younger one with real work and real responsibility, carry a kind of tension and warmth that no casting director could manufacture. When Ryan was on screen in those early seasons, what the audience was watching was a genuine apprenticeship playing out inside a genuine family business. That is not common on television, and it is not replaceable once it's gone. And that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around him saw coming. There is a specific kind of pressure that comes with learning a skilled trade in front of a national audience, and it's worth taking a moment to actually think about what that experience involves, because it's easy to romanticize and much harder to live. When Ryan Eldridge appeared in the early seasons of Maine Cabin Masters, he was a teenager, not a young adult with a developed sense of identity and a clear professional trajectory, but a teenager in the process of becoming someone. That process, which is messy and non-linear for everyone, was playing out in front of viewers who numbered in the millions on a good week. Every moment where he didn't know something was captured on film. Every exchange where Chase or another senior crew member had to redirect him, correct him, or slow down to explain something was preserved in the episode archive. That's not a criticism of how the show was made. That honesty was part of what made it work. But it's worth naming clearly, because the experience of being a teenager whose learning curve is public property is genuinely unusual and not without cost. For most people who learn a trade, the early mistakes happen in relative obscurity. Your journeyman period is something you move through in front of a small audience of colleagues and supervisors, and by the time anyone outside your immediate work circle pays attention to you, you've already developed enough competence to not be defined by the beginner's errors. Ryan didn't get that. The beginner's errors were part of the show. What he got instead was something that cuts the other way. Millions of people watched him figure things out. Millions of people saw him take feedback, adjust, try again. Millions of people saw him operate within the structure of a family that held him accountable, not because of a production contract, but because that's what families and trades businesses do. There's a version of that experience that becomes the most formative thing in a young person's life, not because of the television, but because of what the television was incidentally documenting. The skills were real, the relationships were real. The work ethic being modeled for him by Chase and the senior crew was real. Ryan was absorbing all of it during the years when a person is most receptive to absorbing it, his teens and early 20s, when the patterns of how you approach your work and your relationships and your commitments are still being established. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. The audience for Maine Cabin Masters developed a specific kind of attentiveness that long-running reality shows always cultivate in their most devoted viewers. These are people who have spent enough hours with a cast that they notice small things, a change in how someone carries themselves, a different energy between two people on screen, a familiar face showing up in the background of fewer shots than they used to. With Ryan Eldridge, the noticing happened gradually and then all at once. He didn't vanish from a single season to the next in a way that demanded explanation. His presence diminished across time, less screen time in some seasons, fewer featured moments, a shift from someone who was regularly central to the episode's story to someone who was occasionally visible in the work being done, but rarely foregrounded in the narrative. The comment sections on YouTube and the discussion threads on fan forums filled up with versions of the same question. Where did Ryan go? Is he still on the show? Did something happen between him and Chase? Did he leave Maine? The speculation was wide-ranging, because when a show declines to explain a cast member's reduced presence, the audience fills the silence with their own theories. Here's what was actually happening, and it's more straightforward than most of the theories gave it credit for being. Ryan was growing up. The teenager who had appeared in the show's early seasons was becoming a young adult, and young adults have different relationships with their time and their commitments than teenagers do. When you're 16 or 17 and your uncle's television show is filming, showing up is easy because your schedule is largely someone else's creation. When you're 22 or 23, with your own developing sense of what you want your days to look like and what you want to be building toward, the calculus changes. Maine Cabin Masters was still filming. Chase and the core crew were still doing the work. But Ryan's place in that daily rhythm was naturally evolving, not because of any dramatic rupture, but because that's what happens when young people in family businesses come into their own sense of who they are and what they want their role to be. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. Here's what consistently gets overlooked in discussions about Ryan Eldridge's fading presence on Maine Cabin Masters, and it's the most important thing to understand. The skills he acquired on camera were permanent. The cameras were temporary. The skills were not. Carpentry, structural assessment, working with older materials, understanding how Maine's specific climate and geography affect a building over decades, that knowledge doesn't have an off switch. You don't learn it and then lose it when the television production moves on. You carry it forward into every piece of work you do afterward, and it compounds over time the way all skilled knowledge does. Ryan came from a family where the trades were not a career choice in the way that most people think about career choices. They were a cultural inheritance. Chase Morrill didn't decide one day to become a cabin restorer the way someone might decide to become an accountant or a graphic designer. He grew up in a world where this was what people did, what was valued, what was passed down. Ryan inherited that world. That inheritance is more durable than a television credit. In Maine's trades community, which is tight-knit and reputation-based in the way that small state skilled trades communities always are, who you are and what you can do matters more than what you've appeared in. Ryan wasn't going to lose standing in that community because the cameras stopped following him. His standing was built on the same foundation as everyone else's in that world, the quality of the work and the reliability of the person doing it. So when his on-screen presence diminished, what the audience experienced as an absence wasn't experienced the same way inside the world Ryan actually lived in. He was still embedded in Maine, still embedded in the trades, still connected to the family network that the show had made famous, but that had existed as a functional and respected entity long before any network discovered it. The platform was always secondary to the foundation, and the foundation was never going anywhere. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. To understand what Ryan's arc on the show meant, and what its conclusion means, you have to understand what Maine Cabin Masters was doing for its audience at a cultural moment when that particular kind of content was quietly starved for. The show premiered during a period when the dominant story in American popular culture about young people and work was largely about technology, college credentials, and white-collar aspiration. The trades had spent decades being framed, in education policy, in career counseling, in entertainment, as a fallback for people who couldn't pursue something better. The message, delivered through 1,000 different channels, was that skilled manual work was what you did if the other doors didn't open for you. Maine cabin masters pushed back against that framing without ever making it the explicit subject of a single episode. It pushed back simply by taking the work seriously, by depicting skilled trades as requiring genuine intelligence, problem-solving, creativity, and expertise that took years to develop. The cabins the crew restored weren't simple projects. They were structurally complex, historically interesting, and emotionally significant to the families who owned them. The work required care, and the crew brought care. Ryan Eldridge, in this context, functioned as the character the younger members of the audience could locate themselves in. He wasn't the expert. He was the person becoming an expert, which is a stage of development that most people are in for most of their lives but rarely see depicted with any respect or attention on television. Watching Ryan make mistakes and get corrected and improve was, for a certain segment of the audience, the most honest depiction of what it actually feels like to learn something difficult that they had encountered on television in years. That's a specific kind of value that's easy to take for granted while it's present and only fully appreciate once it's gone. The show was quietly making an argument that the kind of life Ryan was building, rooted in a specific place, built on a specific set of skills, embedded in a family and a community, was worth depicting, worth taking seriously, worth caring about. She never talked about this publicly. Until now, well, this is Ryan's story, and what he never talked about publicly was what he was quietly building away from the cameras during the seasons when his screen time was shrinking. When Maine Cabin Masters moved to the Magnolia Network, the channel built around Chip and Joanna Gaines' brand of warmth, craftsmanship, and home-centered American life. It landed in a context that suited it well. Magnolia's audience was already oriented toward the values the show had always embodied. The transition brought Maine Cabin Masters a new distribution platform and a new wave of viewers without requiring it to fundamentally change what it was. For the production and cast, however, network transitions create practical ripple effects that aren't always visible to the audience. How many episodes get ordered, how they're structured, which projects get featured, how the edit frames the crew. All of these decisions can shift when a show moves from one home to another. The show's identity remained intact. The specifics of how that identity was expressed across any given season were subject to new conversations with new network partners. Within this context, the evolution of the ensemble cast, who was prominently featured, who appeared in supporting roles, who was present on set but less present in the finished episodes, reflected a combination of production decisions, individual crew members' availability and choices, and the natural evolution of what the show needed at different points in its run. Ryan's reduced visibility in the Magnolia Network era wasn't the product of a single decision or a single event. It was the accumulation of many small factors, his own evolving sense of what he wanted his adult life to look like, the production's evolving sense of what each season needed, and the simple reality that a person who was introduced to a national audience as a teenager cannot remain a teenager indefinitely. The show adapted around him, as shows adapt around all their cast members over time. The core, Chase, the cabins, Maine itself, remained constant. Everything else was always in some degree of motion. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. Ryan Eldridge's story resists the narrative template that audiences tend to reach for when a familiar face disappears from a television show. The template usually involves one of a few familiar plots, a falling out behind the scenes, a personal struggle that made continuing impossible, an opportunity elsewhere that pulled the person away, or a production decision that was handed down from above and accepted without recourse. Ryan's story doesn't fit cleanly into any of those. What it fits into instead is something harder to dramatize but more genuinely interesting. A young person figuring out what kind of life they want to live and making choices accordingly. He came onto the show with a specific relationship to the work, as an apprentice, as a nephew, as someone whose primary identity was rooted in learning rather than leading. Over the years the show ran, that identity naturally had to evolve. You cannot stay an apprentice forever. At some point, the skills you've accumulated and the experience you've gathered push you towards something more autonomous, more self-directed, more your own. That transition, from person being formed to person who has been formed, is one of the most significant passages in any individual life. For most people, It happens in relative privacy. For Ryan, the early stages of it happened on television, which meant that when the later stages called for something more private, the contrast was visible in a way it wouldn't have been otherwise. What the fans experienced as an absence was, from Ryan's perspective, more likely experienced as a clarification of what he wanted, of where he wanted to put his energy, of what kind of work felt like his own rather than inherited. That's not a rejection of the family business or the family values. It's the thing the family business and the family values had been building toward all along. The trades don't produce good workers by keeping people in apprentice roles indefinitely. They produce good workers by giving apprentices enough time and experience that they eventually develop into something more. Ryan's reduced presence on screen may well be the marker of exactly that development, the point at which he had enough of his own to step out of the frame and operate as something more fully formed. That's it. One phone call, one conversation. That's all it takes, sometimes. A moment when you realize that the version of your life you've been living in service of someone else's vision is ready to become something more specifically your own. There is a question underneath all the fan speculation about Ryan Eldridge that is more interesting than the surface question of where he went. The deeper question is, what did his presence mean while it lasted, and what does its fading tell us about what Maine Cabin Masters was actually doing? The show's consistent achievement across its run was making a specific argument about value, about what counts as a good life, a meaningful career, a worthy use of time and skill. That argument was never made explicitly. It was made through accumulation. Episode after episode of watching people who were good at their work, treating that work with seriousness, and the people they worked for with respect. That accumulation built something in the audience, a feeling, not quite articulable but definitely real, that this was a picture of how things could be done. Ryan was part of that argument. His particular contribution was temporal. He represented the argument's extension into the future. Chase and the senior crew were proof that the trades could produce accomplished, respected, well-rooted adults. Ryan was proof that the next generation was capable of inheriting and continuing that. When Ryan's presence diminished, it raised an implicit question that the show has never fully answered on screen. Did the next generation inherit it? Is there continuity? The audience's attachment to Ryan was, at least in part, an attachment to the reassurance his presence provided, that the world the show depicted had a future as well as a present. His absence doesn't answer that question one way or the other. What it does is leave it open in a way that sits with attentive viewers longer than almost any explicit plot development would. Ryan is still in Maine. He's still part of the trades world the show made nationally visible. He's still connected to the family and the community that formed him during the years when the cameras were rolling. The life he's building is just quieter than it was for a while. And quieter doesn't mean lesser. That's perhaps the most Maine Cabin Masters lesson of all. The value of a thing is not determined by how visible it is. Some of the most important work gets done with no audience at all. Ryan Eldridge didn't lose something when he faded from the screen. He graduated from one phase of a life into the next, which is what the show had always been showing, in its own way, was the point. Maine Cabin Masters was never really a show about cabins. It was a show about what it looks like when people care about something enough to do it well, pass it on, and build something that outlasts any individual season or episode. Ryan's arc on the show was the most direct version of that theme the production ever aired, even if it didn't fully recognize it while it was happening. A young man learning, becoming, and then stepping away from the camera to be whatever he'd become. That's not a departure from the show's values. That's their fulfillment. His next chapter belongs to him now, not to a production schedule or a network's content calendar. Whether that eventually circles back to television, stays rooted in Maine's trades community, or takes a shape nobody has predicted yet, it's being built on a foundation that the audience got to watch being laid, season by season, in real time. So here's the question worth sitting with. Do you think Ryan made the right call stepping back from the spotlight while the show was still going strong? Or is a platform like that the kind of thing you only get once, and walking away from it, whatever your reasons, is a mistake you don't get to undo?